Let's start at the foundation, Kate. Can you explain to us what exactly culturalization is in your view and why it's so much more than just simple translation?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically what happens when we create content for global markets, which is pretty much every piece of content that's ever made today, what typically happens in the past is that they would generate, let's say, a piece of software, like in my days at Microsoft back in the 90s and early 2000s, where you make a product like Microsoft Excel or Word, and of course you want it to be compatible with other countries and other cultures, so you localize it, which means you do language translation. So all the UI and all the text, of course, is localized into the local language. And that's been pretty standard for software for decades now, and including games, because games are software as well. But what we find is that especially with games, because they are such a broader, more immersive, it's not just about using a spreadsheet or writing a letter or something. It's a whole world that you're going to experience. There's a lot of elements inside that world that may or may not be compatible with the different cultures. So it's not just about legibility through language translation. Now it's about how do the ideas within this world and the characters and the factions and the narrative and everything else that goes into the world building, how does all of that kind of translate, so to speak, not language translation, but culturally translate into another culture, and make sure that the ideas that we want to convey and the story that we're trying to tell is actually going to be understood at a fundamental level in these other cultures. And so that's really where culturalization comes in. It's looking beyond just the language aspect and all the other things that are in the environment, which you can imagine in a game, because it's a world that's being built. It's like everything: character design, buildings, environments,
All of the above, the clothing,
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The architecture, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a great overview. It's clear to me that culturalization is essential, especially the bigger and more global scope you're trying to have. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into what it means to work as a culturalization strategist. So I know that's the work that you do a lot of, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your role.
Yeah, so my role, just so people have a little bit of background about how this even happened, because this is not a standard role. You don't find many culturalization strat out there at all. So basically, as a geographer, I went into Microsoft way back in 1992 as a cartographer to make the maps on Encarta Encyclopedia, which some people might remember Encarta back in the 90s. A lot of people grew up with it. I worked on Encarta Encyclopedia. Yay! For people who don't know, Encarta was essentially the last digital encyclopedia before Wikipedia showed up online. So it was a hard media, CD-ROM, DVD that they would ship with Windows and other software. And a lot of people had it as a resource when they were growing up. And so I made all the maps for Encarta way back in 1992. And I thought it was just going to be a quick 6-month contract and then I'm done. But then they renewed the contract and had me work on other stuff there, and eventually offered me a full-time position at the company, where they basically said, hey, just write the job description and we'll hire you into the role. And what they wanted me to do, yeah, that's the good old days. You don't really see that happen much anymore. But what they wanted me to do was basically be the geopolitical strategist for Microsoft. And what that entailed was basically on all the mapping products that were being made, because Microsoft was making a huge push into different mapping products back then. They needed somebody to help them navigate all the complexities of how do you show Taiwan, and how do you show the disputed area of Kashmir, northern India, and how do you show all these other parts of the world that are tricky when you're trying to sell into different markets. And I could do that. That was part of my background as a cartographer and geographer, so I found that pretty easy to do. And so that was my first job at Microsoft, but eventually it evolved into doing a lot more, because I was getting questions from all over the company about all kinds of things. Is this gesture okay? Is this flag correct? All that kind of stuff. In fact, I had an internal alias at Microsoft called Dr. Ware. So I was Dr. Ware at Microsoft, where people could just send internal queries to Dr. Ware and get all kinds of geography questions answered. And eventually what happened is we had this whole thing happen between Encarta World Atlas and then Age of Empires that happened way back in 1997 that really, it was a flare-up of sensitivities with the South Korean government, which I don't have time to go. That's a whole hour in itself to explain that whole story. But suffice to say, it gave me the idea to create a new kind of team at Microsoft that I called geopolitical strategy, to effectively help the company avoid making political and cultural mistakes across all of their content, including all the games that they were starting to work on back then. And so that team eventually got created in 1998, and I basically managed that effort until I left in 2005 and created an internal process to effectively help all the Microsoft products basically be compatible with different markets culturally and geopolitically, not just from a localization standpoint. And that's essentially how I started working on games, because that team and that mission gave me the mandate to work on all Microsoft products. And being a huge geek myself and being a lifelong gamer, because Pong was my first game, because that's how old I am. For me, I found my perfect calling. Doing culturalization work on games was like the absolute best thing I could ever hope for. And that's essentially how I got into it. And so I essentially defined what a culturalization strategist does. And so without that prelude, to answer your question, a culturalization strategist, essentially what you do is you work alongside the people creating these worlds. And I say worlds meaning it doesn't just have to be a game world. It can also be the world of information that is in a product like Microsoft Excel or Google Maps or whatever it is, because every one of these experiences is an information space. It's an information world that we are creating and presenting to the user, where there are certain expectations of user behavior, as well as things that we're presenting in a certain UI and user experience that essentially is guiding them on how we want them to perceive something. And that's really where I come in, and where a culturalization strategist is useful, is to help them understand how do people across different locales perceive things, because it's not going to be perceived universally, even though, yes, we're all human, and the faculties we have, the physicality we have to perceive things is pretty much the same. But beyond that, there's all the layers of culture and upbringing and all the other things that influence how we actually perceive things. And that's where I come into play.
Makes sense. It sounds like understanding all the nuances that come with different cultures and geography. All of that seems like such a big, giant, complex process. I've heard you give presentations at events, and wow, all the stuff that you've got to be thinking about. It's so massive of just a subject matter. With that in mind, that's the how, that's the role. We can move to the what.